close your eyes and journey through time to a wedding morning in the deep heart of the 15th century. The atmosphere inside the stone manor is heavy, a blend of expensive beeswax candles and the damp, lingering chill of a European spring. In the center of a dimly lit chamber, the focal point of the day sits perfectly still. She is a youthful figure, at a stage defined by the heavy social requirements of her century. They are not just preparing a person, they are constructing a societal icon. They begin with a small, ornate jar, the most formidable mineral agent in a woman's traditional repertoire, replaced by a cold radiance. This is the recorded reality of the historical bride, a woman who was taught that her only path to survival was to embrace a fatal physiological toll. They begin the transformation with a small, ornate vessel containing a thick, brilliant white paste. This is the legendary Venetian Ceruse, the most coveted, the most expensive, and the most formidable mineral agent in a woman's traditional repertoire. As the first layer is spread with cold precision across her brow, her natural warmth seems to retreat. Her freckles, those marks of the sun, are hidden away. Her individuality is slowly masked, replaced by a cold, porcelain-like radiance that mimics the still statues of the saints. She looks breathtaking. She looks beyond the earthly realm. But beneath that flawless white mask, a silent war has already begun. The lead in the makeup is beginning its slow, corrosive journey. It seeps into her pores, enters her bloodstream, and starts a microscopic feast upon her very flesh. Even as she smiles at her reflection, the chemicals are thinning her skin, turning it gray and brittle, preparing to leave her scarred and unrecognizable by the time her first anniversary arrives. This is not a fairy tale. This is the horrifying, documented reality of the medieval Bridal woman who was taught that her only path to survival was to slowly, beautifully, systemic, physiological toll. Today, we are pulling back the heavy velvet curtains of history. We are looking past the romantic tapestries and the heroic ballads to find the women who paid the ultimate price for elegance. Over the next few hours, we will explore 15 chapters of a forgotten nightmare. We will investigate the toxic chemistry of the boudoir, the brutal physical mutilations disguised as fashion, and the chilling economic systems that put a literal price tag on a woman's face. Why did they do it? Why did a mother hand her daughter a vial of poison as a wedding gift? Why did the most powerful queens in Europe wear masks of death that were an inch thick? To understand the medieval bride, you must first understand the world she inhabited. A world where a woman's face was her only currency, her only shield, and quite often, her executioner. Imagine the pressure. In a society where you cannot own property, where you cannot choose your path, and where your family's entire fortune might depend on the alliance formed by your marriage, looking plain was not just a social failure, it was a catastrophe. A scar from childhood smallpox wasn't just a blemish, it was a debt your father had to pay in gold to convince a man to take you. Beauty was survival. And if survival required lead, mercury, and arsenic, then these women would drink from the poisoned chalice without a second thought. As the bells of the cathedral begin to chime in the distance, calling the town to witness the union, our bride is finally ready. Her skin is as white as a ghost, her lips as red as a fresh wound, and her eyes enlarged by the juice of the deadly nightshade stare out into a world that demands her perfection at the cost of her life. She stands up, her heavy silk robes rustling against the cold floor, and begins her walk toward the altar. She does not know that the clock is already ticking. She does not know that the very rituals meant to celebrate her life are the ones that will shorten it In this deep dive, we aren't just telling a story of makeup and dresses. We are telling a story of power, of sacrifice, and of the incredible, terrifying lengths humans will go to meet the standards of their time. We will see the madness induced by mercury, the blindness caused by belladonna, and the chilling silence of the legal verification ritual where privacy went to die. So, dim the lights. Let the world of the 21st century fade away. We are traveling back to a time of deadly elegance, where every blush was a chemical reaction and every kiss carried a trace of metal. This is the fatal price of medieval beauty. This is the story of the brides who died to be perfect. Before we dive into the specific poisons, we must first understand the origin of this obsession. Why was whiteness the gold standard of the Middle Ages? It wasn't just a preference, it was a declaration of class. If your skin was pale, it meant you never had to labor under the sun. It meant you were protected, wealthy, and refined. But as we will see in the next chapter, achieving that heavenly glow required a pact with a very earthly devil: lead. In the courts of medieval Europe, your skin was not just an organ. It was a canvas upon which your entire social destiny was painted. To be brown, to be tanned, or to have the slightest kiss of the sun upon your cheeks was to be common. It was the mark of the peasant, the field worker, the woman who had no choice but to toil in the dirt under a scorching sky. But for a lady, for a bride of noble birth, the ideal was something else entirely. She was expected to be alabaster. Her skin was meant to be so pale, so translucent, that you could almost see the blue veins running beneath her surface like rivers of royal blood. This wasn't just beauty, it was a loud, silent declaration of leisure. It said, "I have never worked, I have never been touched by the sun, I am pure." But nature is rarely so cooperative. Real skin has texture. It has imperfections, scars, and warmth. To achieve the impossible whiteness demanded by society, the medieval woman turned to chemistry, and the most legendary substance of all was Venetian Ceruse. To the modern ear, the name sounds exotic, perhaps even romantic. But in the laboratories of the 15th century, Ceruse was a nightmare in a jar. It was made by a process that sounds more like alchemy than cosmetics. Lead shavings were placed in pots with vinegar, then sealed and buried in heaps of horse manure for weeks. The chemical reaction between the lead, the acid, and the heat of the fermenting manure produced a fine, white powder, basic lead carbonate. This powder was then ground down, mixed with water or egg whites, and sometimes a touch of lavender oil to mask the metallic tang. The result was a thick, heavy paste with incredible coverage. It didn't just hide blemishes, it obliterated them. It turned a human face into a marble mask. When a bride applied Ceruse, she wasn't just putting on makeup, she was putting on a shield. It caught the flickering candlelight of the wedding feast in a way that made her appear to glow from within, like an angel brought to life. It was breathtakingly beautiful, and it was pure, unadulterated poison. Imagine the routine. Every morning, the bride's attendants would apply a fresh layer. They didn't wash off the old layer first. That would be a waste of the precious, expensive pigment. Instead, they would simply layer the new paste over the old. Over the course of a week, a woman's face could be covered in a shell of lead nearly half an inch thick. Beneath that shell, the skin began to suffocate. Lead is a heavy metal, and the body has no natural way to process it. As the ceruse sat on the warm skin, the lead was absorbed directly into the bloodstream. The first signs of the lead scandal were often subtle: a lingering headache, a strange metallic taste in the mouth, a loss of appetite that was often praised by society as maidenly delicacy. But as the months turned into years, the true horror of the alabaster obsession revealed itself. Lead is a corrosive. As it entered the pores, it began to eat away at the very skin it was supposed to beautify. The woman would wake up to find her natural complexion turning a sickly, ashen gray. Deep pits and sores would begin to erupt on her cheeks and forehead. Her skin would become wrinkled and brittle, sagging far beyond her years. But the medieval bride was trapped in a tragic, lethal paradox. When she saw the lead damaging her skin, making it gray and scarred, she didn't stop using it. She couldn't. To be seen without her white face would be social suicide. Her husband would be repulsed. Her peers would whisper of disease. So, what did she do? She applied more. She put on thicker layers of ceruse to hide the grayness caused by the ceruse. She used heavier coats of lead to fill the pits created by the lead. It was a vicious, downward spiral where the cure and the poison were the exact same thing. And it wasn't just the skin that suffered. Lead poisoning, or plumism, is a systemic destroyer. As the lead levels in the bride's blood rose, her body began to fail from the inside out. Her hair would begin to thin and fall out, starting at the hairlina phenomenon that actually became a fashion trend as women began to pluck their hair back even further to mimic the noble high forehead of the poisoned elite. Her teeth would begin to rot and turn black, their enamel destroyed by the constant presence of the metal. Her breath would become foul, a scent of decay masked by cloves and cinnamon. But the most insidious effect was on the mind. Lead crosses the blood-brain barrier with ease. The alabaster bride would find herself suffering from profound melancholy, what we would now call severe depression and anxiety. She would experience tremors in her hands, making it difficult to sew or play music. She would suffer from brain fog, a terrifying confusion that robbed her of her wit and personality. In the final stages, lead poisoning leads to excruciating abdominal pain, known as painter's colic, followed by convulsions, paralysis, and eventually a merciful death. One of the most famous victims of this obsession was Maria Gunning, the Countess of Coventry. She was widely considered the most beautiful woman in 18th century England, a late-stage successor to the medieval lead painting tradition. Her devotion to her white lead makeup was legendary. Her husband, the Earl, was so terrified of her addiction that he would often try to scrub the paint from her face in public, begging her to stop. But Maria refused. She would rather die beautiful than live plain. And die she did at the age of just 27, her organs shut down by the very substance that had made her a star. The newspapers called it death by vanity, but Maria was simply a victim of a standard she didn't create. As we look at the portraits of these women today, with their serene, snow-white faces and their distant, haunting gazes, we must realize that we aren't looking at health. We are looking at a chemical masquerade. The heavenly glow was often the sheen of heavy metal. The maidenly stillness was often the exhaustion of systemic failure. The alabaster bride was a woman living in a prison of her own making, built from the very jars on her dressing table. But as terrifying as the lead was, it only provided half of the look. To truly achieve the medieval ideal, the snow-white skin needed a sharp, vivid contrast. It needed the color of life. It needed a red so bright it looked like blood. And to get that red, the medieval bride had to turn to another, even more volatile element. For if lead was the slow, silent killer of the skin, the substance she used for her lips and cheeks was a fire that burned through her nerves. In the next chapter, we will explore the vivid crimson world of Tuin Gan. If you think the lead was bad, wait until you see what women did to get the perfect rosebud pout. If the lead-white mask of the medieval bride was the snow of a winter's morning, her lips were meant to be the first berries of spring. To achieve the perfect rosebud pout, a color so vivid it seemed to pulsate with life, the women of the Middle Ages turned to a substance as beautiful as it was lethal: cinnabar. Also known as vermilion, this brilliant scarlet pigment was made from mercuric sulfide. It was the color of passion, the color of power, and as many women would find out too late, the color of madness. Imagine our bride again. Her face is already a frozen mask of white lead. But to the eyes of her groom and the guests at the banquet, she looks incomplete, ghostly, perhaps even corpse-like. To bring the spark of life back to her face, her attendants reach for a small silver pot. Inside is a fine, heavy powder, redder than any rose petal. They mix it with a little fat, perhaps some honey or beeswax, to create a slick, vibrant paste. They apply it carefully to her lips, shaping them into a tiny, perfect bow. Then, they smudge a soft glow of the same red onto her cheeks, creating a maidenly blush that suggests health, fertility, and modesty. The visual effect is stunning. Against the deathly pallor of the lead, the cinnabar red pops with an almost supernatural intensity. It is the signature look of the Renaissance, the look of the Venetian noblewoman, the look of the English queen. But the chemical reality is a horror story in progress. Every time the bride licks her lips, every time she takes a sip of wine from a silver goblet, every time she breathes in the fine dust of her rouge, she is inviting mercury into her body. And unlike lead, which slowly erodes the skin, mercury is an invader of the soul. Mercury is a neurotoxin. It doesn't just sit in the blood, it hunts for the brain. It crosses the most sacred barriers of the human body and begins to dismantle the nervous system from the inside out. For the medieval bride, the mercury curse usually began with the mouth. Because she was applying mercuric sulfide directly to the thin, absorbent skin of her lips, the poison had a direct highway into her system. The first sign was often the mercurial breath, a foul, metallic stench that no amount of cloves or rose water could hide. Her gums would become swollen, bleeding at the slightest touch. Eventually, they would begin to recede and rot, turning a sickly black. Imagine the tragedy of a wedding night where the bride, looking like a porcelain doll from a distance, reveals a mouth of decaying black gums when she speaks or smiles. To hide this, women would avoid smiling broadly, adopting the tight-lipped, mysterious expressions we see in so many historical portraits. We often interpret these expressions as a sign of medieval stoicism or modesty, but in many cases, it was a desperate attempt to hide the physical rot caused by their own beauty products. As the poisoning progressed, their teeth would loosen in their sockets and eventually fall out, one by one. A woman might be 25 years old, a celebrated beauty, yet possess the toothless mouth of an ancient crone beneath her layers of red and white paint. But the rot of the mouth was nothing compared to the rot of the mind. Mercury poisoning produces a specific set of psychological symptoms that were well documented by physicians of the time, though they often misdiagnosed them as female hysteria or the vapors. This condition was later known as erethism. The poisoned bride would find herself plagued by a pathological shyness and an explosive, uncontrollable irritability. She might burst into tears for no reason, or fly into a rage at a servant over a misplaced ribbon. Her personality would begin to dissolve. She would suffer from profound insomnia, lying awake in her heavy bed as her heart hammered against her ribs, her mind racing with paranoid thoughts. Then came the Hatter's shakes. Mercury attacks the motor functions of the brain. The bride would notice a subtle trembling in her fingers. At first, she might hide it by tucking her hands into her voluminous silk sleeves, but the tremors would grow, spreading to her arms, her legs, and eventually her tongue. Her speech would become slurred. Her handwriting, once elegant and fine, would become a chaotic scrawl. In the courts of Europe, these shaky women were common. They were seen as delicate, as fragile, as nervous creatures who needed to be protected. In reality, they were victims of a chemical lobotomy. The irony of the Mercury curse was that it was often used to treat the very problems it caused. Medieval medicine was a chaotic landscape of trial and error. If a woman appeared irritable, depressed, or suffered from tremors, doctors might prescribe mercurial ointments to balance her humors. They were fighting fire with gasoline. They would rub more mercury into her skin to treat the symptoms of mercury poisoning, accelerating her descent into madness. And then there was the impact on the next generation. Mercury is a reproductive assassin. It passes through the placenta with terrifying ease. A bride who used cinnabar rouge throughout her pregnancy was unknowingly poisoning her unborn child. The rates of miscarriage and stillbirth among the noble classes were significantly higher than among the peasantry. And while modern history often points to poor sanitation, the massive toxic load of cosmetics cannot be ignored. Children born to mercurial mothers often suffered from developmental delays, physical deformities, or the same tremors that plagued their parents. The quest for beauty wasn't just killing the women, it was haunting their lineages. One of the most heart-wrenching accounts comes from the medical diaries of a 16th century Italian physician. He describes a young duchess, married only 2 years, who was once the shining sun of the court. By the time he was called to see her, she was a shadow. She sat in a darkened room, her hands shaking so violently she could not hold a cup. She would scream at the sight of her own reflection, convinced that a demon was staring back at her. Her lips, once painted the most beautiful red in Italy, were now a mass of sores. The physician noted her devotion to the finest vermilion from the East. He recognized the connection, but his advice to stop using the rouge was ignored by her family. They believed her beauty was her only value, and to let her appear pale and bloodless in court would be a greater tragedy than her madness. She died in a fit of convulsions just months later, a beautiful corpse with a mind long since shattered. The church, too, played a complex role in this toxic drama. Priests often railed against the use of the devil's paint, calling it a sin of vanity and a deception against God. They warned that a woman who painted her face would be unrecognizable to God on Judgment Day. But their objections were moral, not medical. They didn't tell women that the paint would rot their teeth or drive them mad. They told them it would condemn their souls. For many women, the social requirement to be beautiful, to secure a marriage, to maintain status, to please a husband, was a far more immediate pressure than the distant threat of hellfire. They chose the poison of the earth over the fire of the afterlife. As we conclude this chapter on the Mercury curse, we must see the medieval bride for what she truly was, a person caught in a pincer movement of lethal expectations. On one side, the lead stripped her skin and grayed her flesh. On the other, the mercury rotted her mouth and stole her sanity. She was a chemical construct, a living laboratory experiment conducted in the name of elegance. And yet, the transformation was still not complete. For even with the white skin and the red lips, there was one more feature that had to be altered. A feature that was said to be the very window to her soul, but one that she would willingly cloud with a deadly shadow to achieve the ultimate hypnotic gaze. In our next chapter, we look into the eyes of the bride. We will discover the secret of the deadly nightshade, the plant that promised a gaze of infinite depth, but often left its users stumbling in a world of perpetual darkness. They say the eyes are the windows to the soul. In the medieval and Renaissance world, these windows were expected to be vast, dark, and filled with an almost liquid mystery. For a bride, her gaze was her most powerful tool of seduction and submission. But for many women, those windows were clouded by a shadow that they invited in themselves, a shadow named belladonna. The name itself is a masterpiece of irony. In Italian, belladonna means beautiful woman, but in the world of botany, it belongs to Atropa belladonna, also known as the deadly nightshade. The scientific name Atropa refers to Atropos, one of the three fates in Greek mythology, the one who cuts the thread of life. It is a plant that carries death in its shiny black berries, yet for centuries, it was the secret ingredient in a bride's pre-wedding ritual. Picture the scene just moments before the ceremony. The bride's face is already white with lead, her lips stained red with mercury. But there is one final touch. Her mother or a trusted servant brings a small glass vial. Inside is a clear, slightly green liquid, the distilled juice of the nightshade. With a steady hand, they tilt the bride's head back and let 2 drops fall into each eye. It stings sharply, a cold fire that makes her blink and tear up, momentarily threatening to ruin her expensive makeup. But as the tears are blotted away, a transformation begins to occur within the very center of her being. Within minutes, her pupils, the black circles at the center of her eyes, begin to expand. They grow wider and wider, swallowing the iris until the brown or blue of her eyes nearly disappears into a pool of bottomless darkness. This is a medical condition known as mydriasis, a total dilation of the pupil. In the modern world, we see this in hospital emergency rooms or at the optometrist's office. In the Renaissance world, this was the peak of erotic beauty. Why was this so desirable? There is a biological secret at play here. Human pupils naturally dilate when we are excited, when we are in love, or when we are sexually aroused. By artificially dilating her pupils, the bride was projecting a constant chemical lie to her groom. She was signaling, on a subconscious level, that she was deeply attracted to him, that she was captivated by his presence, and that her desire for him was immense. It made her eyes look soft, dreamy, and hypnotic. It created a look of permanent interest and vulnerability. Men called it the bedroom eye. They found it irresistible. They had no idea they were looking into eyes that were functionally blind. As the bride steps into the cathedral for her wedding, the horror of belladonna reveals itself. Her pupils are now frozen open. They cannot constrict in response to light. The hundreds of candles flickering in the dark stone interior, which should create a romantic atmosphere, are instead a source of agonizing pain. Every flame feels like a needle stabbing into the back of her brain. The sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows is blinding. She cannot focus on the priest. She cannot see the face of her husband clearly. The world has become a blurred, overbright haze of colors and shapes. We see this reflected in historical accounts and art. Why do so many medieval brides keep their eyes cast downward? Why do they seem so modest, so demure, so hesitant to look directly at the world? History tells us it was a sign of maidenly virtue. But medical science suggests a darker reason. They simply couldn't bear to look up. They kept their eyes on the floor because the light was too painful, and their vision was too distorted to navigate the room. A bride being led to the altar by her father or her groom wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was often a practical necessity. She was effectively blind, walking through a fog of her own making. But the physical pain of light sensitivity was only the beginning. Belladonna contains atropine, a potent alkaloid that affects the entire nervous system. As the liquid was absorbed through the tear ducts and into the bloodstream, it began to wreak havoc on the bride's internal organs. Her heart rate would begin to skyrocket, a condition called tachycardia. She would feel her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her mouth would become bone dry, making it difficult to recite her vows. Her skin would become flushed and hot to the touch. In higher doses, or with repeated use, belladonna induces a state of delirium. The bride might start to see things that aren't there, halos around the candles, shadows moving in the corners of her vision, or strange, vivid hallucinations. She might become confused, unable to remember the words she is supposed to say. Imagine a wedding feast where the bride sits at the head of the table, her eyes huge and dark, looking absolutely stunning to her guests, while her heart is racing at 140 beats per minute, and she is struggling to distinguish reality from the toxic fever dreams induced by the nightshade. The long-term consequences were devastating. Repeatedly paralyzing the muscles of the eye with atropine causes permanent damage. Over months and years of use to maintain her captivating gaze, a woman would find her vision permanently blurred. The constant strain and the chronic dilation could lead to early-onset glaucoma or total blindness. We have records from 16th century Italy of former beauties who spent their later years in darkened rooms, unable to bear the touch of a single candle flame, their eyes ruined by the very plant that had once made them the envy of the court. There is a famous portrait from the mid-1400s by the artist Petrus Christus titled Portrait of a Young Woman. She is an icon of the arapale skin, plucked hairline, and eyes that are startlingly dark. For decades, art historians praised the artist's use of contrast, but modern medical analysis looks at those pupils and sees the unmistakable signature of belladonna. She isn't just a model. She is a victim of a beauty standard that required her to sacrifice her sight for a soulful expression. The irony of the windows to the soul is that by trying to make those windows more beautiful, these women were effectively shuttering them. They were trading the ability to see the world for the privilege of being seen by it in a specific, eroticized way. They were closing their eyes to their own reality to become a fantasy for others. As the wedding day draws to a close and the effects of the nightshade begin to wear off, the bride is left with a crushing headache and eyes that ache with a deep throbbing pressure. She has survived the ceremony, she has played her part, and she has successfully deceived her husband with a gaze of manufactured arousal. But she is now one step closer to a world of permanent darkness. And yet, even as her vision fades, the pressure to maintain the other elements of her perfect facade remains. For if her eyes were the windows to her soul, her skin had to remain a glowing, translucent temple, even if that glow had to be fed with the most notorious poison in the history of the world. In our next chapter, we move from the external paints and drops to something even more radical. We will explore the chilling trend of the porcelain pill. We will see how medieval and Victorian brides didn't just put poison on their bodies, they put it into their bodies, swallowing the very essence of death to make their skin shine like a lamp. Imagine a young bride sitting alone in her chamber on the eve of her wedding. She is not reaching for a glass of water to calm her nerves, nor a herbal tea to help her sleep. Instead, she holds a tiny, unassuming white wafer, the porcelain pill. She places it on her tongue and swallows, believing that within hours her blood will transform, her skin will brighten, and she will achieve a luminescence that no lead paint could ever replicate. She is ingesting arsenic, the king of poisons, and she is doing it by choice. In the pursuit of the medieval and later the Victorian ideal of beauty, the external wasn't enough. The lead was too thick, the mercury too messy. To truly look like an ethereal being, the beauty had to come from within. Arsenic provided a shortcut to a look that was described as translucent porcelain. It wasn't just white, it was a skin that seemed to allow light to pass through it, a ghostly, haunting radiance that suggested a woman was made of something finer than mere human flesh. The science behind this glow was a masterpiece of biological irony. Arsenic, when ingested in small, regular doses, acts as a powerful constrictor of the capillaries, the tiny blood vessels near the surface of the skin. By starving the skin of blood, the arsenic effectively bleached the complexion from the inside out. It removed the natural flush of health, the pinkness of life, and replaced it with a stark, waxy pallor. To the groom at the altar, his bride looked like a glowing lamp of purity. In reality, he was looking at a woman whose body was in the first stages of systemic shutdown. But the porcelain pill did more than just whiten the skin. It was marketed as a blood purifier. The logic was that arsenic would kill the impurities in a woman's system that caused freckles, moles, or uneven skin tones. For a bride whose family was desperate to marry her off, a few freckles could be seen as a sign of peasant blood. Arsenic promised to erase those traces of commonality. It promised to refine her, to make her worthy of a noble house. And for a while, it seemed to work. A woman taking arsenic wafers would notice her skin becoming smoother, her eyes appearing brighter, and her body developing a strange, almost feverish energy. This energy was the body's fight or flight response to being poisoned. Arsenic stimulates the thyroid and the nervous system, creating a temporary state of hyperactivity. The bride wouldn't feel the exhaustion of her wedding preparations. She would feel invincible. She would dance all night, her skin glowing, her eyes wide, appearing as the very picture of vitality. But this was a chemical illusion, a final flare of the candle before the wick burns out. The arsenic trap was perhaps the most addictive of all beauty rituals. Unlike makeup, which you could simply stop wearing, arsenic altered your internal chemistry. If a woman stopped taking her porcelain pills, her blood vessels would suddenly dilate. The glow would vanish, replaced by a sudden, violent redness. Her skin would break out in rashes and sores as the body tried to purge the accumulated toxins. To the world, she would look diseased. To avoid this shame, the bride had no choice but to continue the poison, and often, to increase the dose. As the months of marriage passed, the internal corrosion would begin to manifest externally. The first sign of the arsenic curse was often the hair. The very golden locks she had bleached and pampered would begin to fall out in clumps, the follicles destroyed by the metal in her blood. Then came the skin, the very porcelain she had sacrificed for. Arsenic poisoning causes a condition called arsenical keratosis. Hard, warty growths would begin to appear on her palms and the soles of her feet. Her skin, once translucent, would develop dark, mottled patches, making her look like a bruised fruit. Internally, the damage was even more catastrophic. Arsenic is a systemic destroyer. It hunts for the kidneys, the liver, and the lungs. The bride would suffer from chronic, agonizing stomach cramps and a thirst that could never be quenched, a classic sign of internal burning. Her breath would take on a distinctive scent of garlic, a byproduct of the body's desperate attempt to metabolize the metal. Imagine the intimacy of a marriage bed where the bride, despite her beautiful silk gowns, smells of garlic and decay, her body trembling from nerve damage. One of the most chilling aspects of this practice was the arsenic eaters of the Alps, a group of peasants who famously consumed arsenic for stamina. Their stories were used by beauty manufacturers to sell the poison to wealthy women. If the peasants can thrive on it, why can't you? The advertisements implied. But the peasants were consuming crude, naturally occurring arsenic and had built up a tolerance over generations. The noble brides were consuming refined, potent chemical wafers. They weren't building stamina. They were building a grave. And then, there was the impact on the womb. Arsenic is a master of reproductive sabotage. It passes through the placenta with ease, often resulting in silent deaths within the womb. A bride who achieved her porcelain skin through arsenic was often a bride who would never see her children grow. The very beauty that secured her marriage was the same beauty that ensured her lineage would end with her. The history books are full of delicate noblewomen who suffered miscarriage after miscarriage, their deaths eventually attributed to general weakness. We now know that many of them were simply too toxic to support life. The tragedy of the porcelain pill was that it turned a woman's own body against her. It transformed her blood into a weapon and her skin into a prison. She was glowing, yes, but it was the glow of phosphorus in the dark, the light of something that is actively being consumed by fire. She was a living ghost, a porcelain doll that was shattering from the inside out. As we look back at the arsenic brides, we see the ultimate expression of a society that valued the image of health over health itself. They wanted the glow, but they didn't want the warmth. They wanted the translucence, but they didn't want the blood. They wanted a woman who looked like an object, and through the miracle of chemistry, they got exactly what they asked for, at the cost of everything that made her human. But while the poison was working its way through her blood, the medieval bride had other, more immediate physical tortures to endure. For even if her skin was porcelain and her eyes were dark, she was still subject to the brutal requirements of the ideal form. And to achieve that form, she would have to undergo a ritual of physical mutilation that started at the very top of her head. In our next chapter, we will discuss the forehead of God. We will see how the pursuit of intelligence and refinement led women to rip the very hair from their scalps, inch by agonizing inch, snap, a sharp, stinging pinch, snap, another, snap. A tear rolls down the bride's cheek, carving a tiny wet canyon through the thick white lead on her face. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't move. She sits in a high-backed wooden chair, her head held firmly by her mother's hands, while a specialista woman with cold eyes and iron tweezers systematically rips the hair from her scalp, one agonizing strand at a time. This is not a punishment. This is the preparation of the forehead, a ritual of physical mutilation meant to transform a girl into a masterpiece of medieval intelligence. In the 14th and 15th centuries, a woman's beauty was measured in inches specifically, the inches of bare skin between her eyebrows and her hairline. To have a low forehead, one that began where nature intended, was to be seen as animalistic, common, and intellectually stunted. It was the mark of the peasant, the laborer, the woman who had no thoughts beyond her next meal. But for the elite, the ideal was the forehead of God. The perfect face was supposed to be a vast, unbroken expanse of pale skin, with the forehead occupying a full third of the facial structure. To achieve this, nature had to be pushed back violently. Imagine the bride's hairline being treated like an encroaching forest that must be cleared. The specialist begins at the natural edge, where soft baby hairs meet the temple. With each rhythmic snap of the tweezers, the hairline retreats. They are not just removing stray hairs, they are moving the entire boundary of her face upward by 2, sometimes 3 inches. The goal is to create a dome-like, egg-shaped head that suggests a massive, powerful brain and a soul of supreme purity. This obsession had deep religious roots. In the sacred art of the time, the Virgin Mary and the angels were almost always depicted with impossibly high, smooth foreheads, their hair tucked away or removed to emphasize their serene, otherworldly features. To a medieval bride, emulating this look was a way to signal her virtue. If her forehead was high and clear, she was seen as a woman of spiritual depth, a woman whose mind was focused on higher things rather than earthly desires. It was a look of holy intelligence. But the path to holiness was paved with blood and scarred follicles. The pain of plucking thousands of hairs from the most sensitive part of the scalp is a sensation that is difficult to describe. It is a sharp, white-hot needle of pain that radiates through the skull with every pull. The scalp becomes inflamed, bright red and weeping, a stark contrast to the white-painted face. But the specialist cannot stop. If she stops, the symmetry will be ruined. If she stops, the bride will appear half-finished at the altar. So the ritual continues for hours, sometimes spanning several days before the wedding. For those who couldn't endure the slow torture of the tweezers, there were faster, though often more dangerous, alternatives. Medieval beauty manuals like the Trotula collection of women's medical wisdom from the 12th century offered recipes for chemical depilatories. These weren't the gentle creams of the modern world. They were fire in a jar. One popular recipe involved mixing quicklime with arsenic trisulfide, known as orpiment. The bride would apply this caustic paste to her hairline and wait. As the chemicals reacted, they would literally burn the hair off at the root. If left on a minute too long, the mixture would begin to dissolve the skin itself, leaving the bride with permanent, weeping chemical burns on her forehead. Scars she would then have to hide under even thicker layers of toxic lead. Another method was the pitch mask, a mixture of Greek pitch, a sticky resin from pine trees, and beeswax was heated until it was molten. This scalding liquid was smeared across the front of the bride's hair. Once it cooled and hardened into a stiff, immovable plate, it was ripped away in one sudden violent motion. It took the hair, the roots, and often the top layer of skin with it. The screaming was considered a natural part of the process, a small price for a noble appearance. But here is the most twisted part of the forehead scandal. Why did this look become so popular in the first place? Why did women decide that a receding hairline was the peak of beauty? The answer takes us back to our previous chapters: lead and mercury. Chronic poisoning from ceruse and cinnabar causes alopecia hair loss. The noble women of the early Middle Ages, who were the first to use heavy metal cosmetics, were the first to find their hair thinning and their hairlines retreating as a side effect of their beauty. Instead of admitting they were being poisoned, the elite did what they always do. They turned their disability into a trend. If the most powerful duchesses in Europe were losing their hair at the temples, then losing your hair at the temples must be the height of fashion. Suddenly, A receding hairline wasn't a symptom of disease, it was a sign of status. And so, healthy women who weren't yet poisoned enough to lose their hair naturally had to artificially create the same balding effect through plucking and burning. They were literally mutilating themselves to look like they were dying, because dying was what the wealthy did. The consequences of this ritual were permanent. Repeatedly traumatizing the follicles in this way eventually causes them to die. The skin of the forehead becomes scarred and smooth, and the hair never grows back. For the medieval bride, this was often the goal one less ritual to endure in the future. But fashion is a fickle mistress. By the late 16th century, the high forehead began to fall out of style. Hairlines were expected to move forward again. For the thousands of women who had spent their youth destroying their hairlines to look intelligent, there was no going back. They were left with permanently distorted faces, forever trapped in a trend that had moved on without them. Imagine the wedding night of such a bride. She removes her heavy, jeweled veil to reveal a scalp that is raw, covered in tiny scabs and weeping follicles. Her forehead is an unnatural, waxen dome. To her husband, she is a vision of high-class perfection. But to herself, she is a woman whose very skull throbbed with the memory of every hair that had been stolen from her. She has sacrificed her comfort, her skin, and her natural form to meet a standard that was born from the very poison in her veins. But the forehead of God was only the beginning of the hair's transformation. For once the forehead was cleared, the hair that remained could not be left in its natural state. It had to be altered, lightened, and brightened until it shone with a light that was truly celestial. And to get that golden glow, the medieval bride was about to subject her already traumatized scalp to a chemical assault that would make the plucking feel like a caress. In our next chapter, we look at the Venetian bleach. We will see how brides used everything from sulfuric acid to human urine to achieve the perfect golden locks, and why the price of gold was often a scalp covered in blisters. Imagine a shimmering summer afternoon in Venice. The canals reflect the amber glow of the setting sun, and the marble palazzos stand like silent sentinels of wealth. But if you look up, high above the bustling streets, you will see a strange sight on the wooden rooftop terraces known as Altaine. There, seated in the sweltering heat, are the noble women of the city. They wear magnificent silk gowns, but their heads are adorned with something bizarre, the solana. It is a straw hat with a massive circular brim, but no crown. The top is completely cut out, allowing their hair to be spread across the brim like a fan of dark silk. They sit there for 6, 8, 10 hours at a time, their scalps soaked in a caustic alchemy, waiting for the sun to burn their hair into gold. In the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, blonde hair wasn't just a color, it was a celestial requirement. To have golden locks was to be associated with the divine, with the Virgin Mary, and with the purity of the stars. Dark hair, while natural to the Mediterranean, was seen as earthly and heavy. A bride walking down the aisle with raven hair was beautiful, yes, but a bride with hair like spun sunshine was a miracle. She was a living icon of grace. And for the Venetian bride, whose city was the gateway to the exotic pigments of the East, the quest for Venetian blonde was a relentless, chemical war against her own biology. The process of bleaching hair in the 15th century was a brutal trial of endurance. It began with the wash of fire. Before a woman climbed to her rooftop, her hair was saturated with a mixture of lye potassium hydroxide and water. Lye is a substance so corrosive it is used today to dissolve organic matter in drains. On the human scalp, it strips away the protective oils instantly, leaving the hair shaft raw and vulnerable. But lye was only the base. To this, they added the activators. For the wealthy, the activators were expensive. Saffron for a warm yellow tone, sulfur for chemical intensity, and alum to fix the color. But for those seeking the most aggressive lift, there was a secret ingredient that cost nothing but carried a heavy price: human urine. Ammonia is one of the most effective natural bleaching agents, and in the absence of modern hydrogen peroxide, women would collect fermented urine to soak their tresses. Imagine the scent of the Venetian heat, the salt of the sea, the perfume of expensive oils, and the sharp, choking stench of ammonia rising from a bride's head as the sun began to bake the chemicals into her skin. As the woman sat on her altana, the Solana hat served two purposes. The wide brim protected her precious, lead-painted face from the sun because to be blonde was divine, but to be tanned was a social death sentence. Meanwhile, the open crown allowed the sun's UV rays to hit the chemical-soaked hair directly. The heat triggered a violent reaction. The lye and ammonia would break down the melanin in the hair, while the sulfur and saffron deposited a golden tint. But the chemicals didn't just stay on the hair. They seeped downward. The price of gold was often a scalp covered in weeping blisters. The combination of caustic lye and intense Mediterranean heat created a literal chemical burn. As the hours passed, the bride would feel her head beginning to sizzle. The skin would turn bright red, then begin to peel and crack. Many women suffered from chronic sores that never fully healed, leaving their scalps sensitive to the touch for the rest of their lives. And then there were the fumes. Breathing in the mixture of sulfur and ammonia in the stagnant heat of a rooftop caused severe respiratory distress. The fainting brides of Venice weren't just overwhelmed by the heat. They were being lightheaded by the toxic gases rising from their own scalps. But the medieval bride was undeterred. If her hair was still too dark after the first day, she would return to the roof the next morning, and the morning after that. Some women spent weeks in the sun before their wedding, pushing their bodies to the edge of heat stroke just to achieve that specific honey-colored radiance. They would rub oil of vitriol, which we now know as sulfuric acidanto stubborn patches of dark hair, a practice so dangerous it often resulted in permanent baldness. When the hair was finally golden, it was no longer hair in the way we understand it. The chemical assault destroyed the keratin structure entirely. The result was hair that was brittle, straw-like, and prone to snapping at the slightest tension. To hide this chemical straw, brides would coat their hair in heavy oils and fats, scented with expensive musk and ambergris, to give it a manufactured shine. They were essentially wearing a crown of dead, beautiful fiber that required constant maintenance to keep from crumbling. The tragedy of the Venetian bleach was that it was a status symbol built on self-destruction. Only a woman of great wealth could afford the time to sit on a roof for weeks. Only a woman with servants could afford to have someone carry water and chemicals to her terrace. The golden hair was a signal to her husband and to the world. I am so wealthy that I can afford to spend my life chasing the sun. It was a declaration of leisure written in ruined hair and scarred skin. Imagine the wedding night when the heavy jeweled crown is finally removed. Beneath it lies a scalp that is tender, perhaps still scabby from the most recent bleaching session. The hair, while golden and magnificent under the candlelight, feels like dry grass to the touch. The bride has achieved the angelic ideal, but she has done so by subjecting her brain's only protection to a scorched earth policy. She is a vision of celestial light but her head is a map of chemical battlefields. And yet, even as she nursed her burned scalp, the medieval bride knew her work was not done. For the golden hair and the white face were merely the stage. The true performance of virtue required a body that was as pure and clean as a saint's, or at least, a body that appeared to be. To achieve this, she would have to step into the most dangerous ritual of all, the bridal bath, a place where the line between hygiene and catastrophe was as thin as a layer of alum. In our Theo, we will enter the chamber of the bath. We will see why medieval people were terrified of water and how brides used everything from quicklime to wine and honey in their bon tom to purify their skin, often with explosive and infectious results. Water was a dangerous element in the medieval mind. For a bride preparing for the most important day of her life, the decision to submerge her body in a bath was a calculated risk, a high-stakes gamble between the desire for holy purity and the very real fear of sudden death. To the people of the 14th and 15th centuries, the skin was not a barrier, but a sieve. They believed that hot water opened the pores' tiny doors into the fortress of the body, and that through these doors, the miasma of the plague and other invisible demons could enter and rot the organs within. Yet tradition demanded the bridal bath. It was a ritual of transition, a way to wash away the maiden self and emerge as a wife. But as we have seen with every other beauty ritual of this era, the medieval world took the concept of cleansing to a lethal extreme. They didn't just want the bride to be clean, they wanted her skin to be transformed. And to achieve that transformation, they turned the bath water into a toxic soup of corrosive chemicals. Imagine a private chamber in a wealthy merchant's home in London or Paris. A massive wooden tub, lined with fine linen to protect the bride's skin from splinters, is filled with steaming water. But this is not clear, pure water. It is a murky, fragrant, and volatile concoction. To refine the skin and close those dangerous pores after the bath, the most common additive was alum. In the modern world, we use alum in small amounts as an astringent. In the medieval bridal bath, it was dumped in by the pound. Alum is an aluminum salt. It tightens the skin, making it feel smooth and firm, but it is also a systemic toxin. As the bride soaked for hours in the hot water, her opened pores allowed the aluminum to be absorbed directly into her tissues, contributing to bone disease and the fading of her vitality. But alum was the least of her worries. To achieve a truly luminous glow, many beauty manuals recommended adding sulfur. In small doses, sulfur can treat skin conditions, but in the quantities used for bridal preparations, it was a recipe for chemical trauma. The stench of rotting eggs would fill the chamber, masking the scent of the rose petals floating on the surface. If the concentration was too high, the bride would emerge not with glowing skin, but with painful red chemical burns across her shoulders and backburns that she would later have to hide under heavy velvet robes and toxic lead powder. Even more terrifying was the use of quicklime calcium oxide. This is a substance so caustic, it is used to dissolve carcasses. Medieval beauty specialists believed that a light touch of quicklime in the bath would dissolve the outer layer of dead common skin, revealing the fresh, pale, noble skin beneath. It was a literal chemical peel of the entire body. The bride would step into the water and feel a terrifying, stinging heat. If she stayed in too long, or if the servant had miscalculated the dose, her skin would begin to blister and peel away in sheets. There are documented cases of brides who suffered such severe burns in their purification bath that they could barely stand at the altar, their bodies hidden in layers of silk to mask the raw, weeping flesh beneath. One of the most horrifying accounts comes from Milan in 1490. A young woman of high birth was being prepared for her marriage to a powerful banker. Her beauty specialist prepared a bath that was supposed to be the pinnacle of luxury. It contained white wine, honey, rose oil, and a massive dose of essence of pearls, which was often pearls dissolved in strong acid. The bride soaked for over 2 hours. By that evening, she was convulsing. Her skin was covered in a violent purple rash, and her lungs were laboring. The toxic mixture, absorbed through her skin and inhaled through the steam, was shutting down her nervous system. The wedding was postponed, and the bride spent months in a darkened room, her beauty ruined by the very ritual meant to perfect it. And yet, for the bride who survived the bath, the danger was only beginning. Because once she stepped out of the water, her skin was at its most vulnerable. Her pores were wide open, her natural protective oils stripped away by lye soaps and alum. This was the moment her attendants would apply the finishers. They would rub her entire body with oils infused with lead or mercury, believing it would seal her purity. They were effectively deep-seeding the poison into her muscles and bones. There was also the psychological weight of the scented lye. Because regular bathing was so rare and feared, body odor was a constant reality. To be a sweet-smelling bride required an overwhelming amount of perfume. They used musk, extracted from animal glands, and ambergris, a waxy substance from the gut of whales. These scents were powerful, almost cloying, but they also served a darker purpose. They masked the smell of the chemical treatments. The scent of a medieval bride was a complex layering of roses, musk, and the faint, metallic tang of the lead and sulfur that were slowly killing her. We must also look at the class divide of the tub. A wealthy bride might risk her life in a bon tam chua jai ru va chat jok, but a poor bride had a different set of dangers. She might wash in a cold river or a shared tub of dirty water, risking infection and parasites. Once again, we see the tragic irony of the era. The poor were dirty, but often physically healthier, while the rich were clean, but chemically compromised. The very luxury of a private, heated, chemically treated bath was a mark of status that doubled as a death warrant. As the steam clears and the bride is dried with soft linen, she looks in the mirror. Her skin is tight from the alum, her body is fragrant with expensive oils, and her mind is perhaps slightly lightheaded from the fumes. She believes she is ready. She believes she has been purified. She has no idea that her cleansing has left her more vulnerable than ever to the lead mask she is about to apply to her face. She has opened the doors of her body, and she has invited the poisons of the world to walk right in. She is now a finished masterpiece, a chemical construct from her bleached hair to her sulfur-soaked toes. But the final transformation is not about her skin or her eyes. It is about her silhouette. For even a pure bride must have the ideal form, and to achieve it, she is about to enter a prison of fabric and bone that will literally reshape her internal organs until she can no longer breathe. In our next chapter, we look at the breathless gown. We will explore the fashion that kills, from dresses dyed with arsenic to the restrictive garments that crushed a woman's ribs in the name of a virtuous silhouette. Imagine the weight of a sin. Now, imagine wearing it. As the medieval bride is led from her toxic bath, she is not simply dressed, she is encased. Her wedding gown is a masterpiece of silk, velvet, and gold, but it is also a physical prison. Every stitch carries a price, and every fold of fabric hides a lethal secret. To the world watching her process toward the altar, she is a vision of shimmering wealth. To the woman inside the dress, she is a captive, struggling for oxygen, her skin reacting to the very dyes that make her look like royalty. In the Middle Ages, the wedding dress was rarely white. That tradition, so familiar to us now, was still centuries away. Instead, a bride wore her finest colors, deep crimsons, regal purples, and most commonly, celestial blues. Blue was the color of the Virgin Mary, the color of fidelity and absolute purity. But to achieve those vivid, saturated hues, the dyers of Europe used a chemical arsenal that transformed the fabric into a toxic wrap. The most vibrant blues were often deepened with copper salt sulfates that, when pressed against the damp, post-bath skin of a nervous bride, would begin to leach. As she sweated under the weight of her robes, the copper was absorbed, causing immediate skin irritation and, over the long hours of the ceremony, contributing to systemic nausea. But if blue was a risk, green was a catastrophe. The most brilliant greens, those that look like the very essence of spring, were often achieved using arsenic compounds. While more infamous in the Victorian era as Scheele's green, the use of arsenic-based mineral pigments in luxury fabrics dates back much further. A bride in a magnificent green gown was effectively wearing a slow-release poison, her body heat acting as the catalyst that freed the toxic particles to enter her lungs and her blood. But the danger of the fabric was only the surface. Beneath the silk lay the structural mutilation of the ideal silhouette. In the high Middle Ages, the beauty standard for women was remarkably different from our own. It was the fertility curve. A beautiful bride was expected to have an emphasized, protruding belia look that suggested she was already ripe for motherhood. To achieve this, dresses were cut with heavy front-loaded padding, and women wore undergarments designed to tilt the pelvis and push the stomach forward. This posture, maintained for hours, put an immense strain on the lower spine and compressed the digestive organs in an unnatural way. It was a silhouette of holy pregnancy, even if the bride was a maiden. But as the era shifted into the Renaissance, the standard flipped. Now, the front had to be as flat and rigid as a stone wall, while the bust was pushed upward to the very chin. This required the stays the early, brutal ancestors of the corset. The stays were not made of flexible elastic. They were constructed from heavy linen, stiffened with glue, and reinforced with busks made of wood, iron, or whalebone. As the bride's mother and sisters pulled the laces, they weren't just tightening a garment. They were reshaping a human skeletal structure. The ribs were forced inward, the lungs were compressed into the upper chest, and the liver was often displaced downward. "Breathe," they would tell her, but she couldn't. With every inch the laces were pulled, her lung capacity dropped. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, a heaving bosom that men found attractive, unaware that it was the sound of a woman suffocating in real time. Fainting during the wedding ceremony was so common, it was seen as a sign of maidenly sensitivity or being overcome by the Holy Spirit. In truth, it was simple oxygen deprivation. The bride's heart would hammer against her constricted ribs, her blood pressure would spike, and eventually her brain would simply shut down to survive the lack of air. And then there was the weight. A noble wedding dress was a display of a family's entire treasury. It was embroidered with real gold thread, not the light, metallic plastics of today, but actual heavy gold wire. Thousands of pearls were sewn into the bodice and sleeves. Pearls symbolized tears and purity, but they also added immense weight. A fully adorned bridal gown could weigh 30, 40, or even 50 pounds. Imagine carrying that weight on a body already weakened by lead, mercury, and a lack of food, since many brides were too constricted to eat. Every step down the long stone aisle of the cathedral was an athletic feat. The heavy train, sometimes 10 feet long and weighted with fur or jewels, pulled backward on her shoulders, forcing her to lean into the restrictive stays just to keep her balance. The physical exhaustion was absolute. By the time the bride reached the altar, she was often in a state of physical shock, her muscles trembling under the load of her own magnificence. One of the most tragic accounts of fashion turned fatal comes from a royal wedding in Spain in 1545. The bride was described as wearing a gown so stiff with gold and jewels that she could not sit down. Her headdress was a massive structure of silver and pearls that required 2 servants to help her balance her head. As she processed through the streets, the combination of the summer heat, the weight of the gold, and the absolute restriction of her stays proved too much. She collapsed inside her dress. Because of the complexity of the laces and the rigidity of the fabric, her attendants could not reach her skin quickly enough to cool her or loosen her breathing. She died there, in the middle of the street, encased in her family's wealth. The official record blamed a sudden humoring of the heart, but the reality was a woman crushed and overheated by her own status. And what about the headdress? The hennin, that iconic cone-shaped hat, was often 2 feet tall. It was balanced on the head with wires and pins that dug into the scalp, already raw from plucking. It acted like a sail, catching every draft of wind in the cold cathedral, threatening to snap the bride's neck if she moved too suddenly. To wear the hennin was to live in a state of constant throbbing tension, a headache that lasted from dawn until the final ritual of the night. The medieval wedding dress was the ultimate beautiful lie. It was a shimmering, golden shell that suggested divinity, but inside, it was a machine of pain. It turned the bride into a statue, an object to be admired, a trophy to be won. Her comfort, her breath, and her safety were sacrificed so that her family could signal their power to the guests. She was the most beautiful person in the room, and she was the one most likely to die before the feast was over. But as the heavy silk rustles and the gold thread catches the light, the bride knows she must endure. For the dress, as heavy and toxic as it is only the beginning of her public performance. She is not just a vision, she is a transaction. And as we move into the next chapter, we will see that the price of her beauty was not just measured in pain, but in gold coins and political power. For her face and her body were the currency in a high-stakes game, where she was the only one with everything to lose. In our next chapter, we discuss the price tag. We will look at the dowry system and how a woman's beauty was literally calculated into a monetary value, and why a single blemish could bankrupt a family. Close your eyes and listen. Beyond the choir's singing and the rustle of silk, there is another sound, the sharp, rhythmic scratching of a quill on parchment. This is the sound of the marriage contract. In the medieval world, love was a luxury few could afford. Marriage was a merger, a political alliance, and above all, a high-stakes business transaction. And in this market, the bride was not the negotiator. She was the commodity. Her face, her hair, and her skin were not hers. They were the assets of her family's estate. Every blemish was a liability, and every drop of beauty was a gold coin saved. Welcome to the cold mathematics of the dowry trap. To understand why a mother would hand her daughter a jar of lead or a vial of nightshade, you must understand the ledger. In cities like Florence, Venice, or London, A father's greatest financial fear wasn't a bad harvest or a lost ship, it was a plain daughter. The dowitha payment from the bride's family to the groom was a mandatory requirement for marriage. But the amount was never fixed. It was a sliding scale, a reverse auction, where the price was determined by the bride's perceived value. Imagine a merchant named Francesco in 14th century Italy. He has 3 daughters. His eldest is a natural beauty, with the pale skin and high forehead that the era demands. Her dowry is set at 300 gold florins, a respectable sum that secures her a match with a rising noble house. But his youngest daughter, Caterina, survived smallpox as a child. Her skin is pitted with scars, and her hair is dark and stubborn. For Caterina, no family will accept 300 florins. To convince a man of equal status to take her, Francesco must offer 500, perhaps 600 florins. That extra 300 florins represents the family's entire profit for a year. It is the difference between prosperity and bankruptcy. This is why beauty was treated with the urgency of a medical emergency. When the beauty specialist was called to the house, she wasn't there for a makeover. She was there for a financial appraisal. She would look at the young girl with a clinical, unfeeling gaze. She would count the freckles. She would measure the hairline. She would inspect the teeth. This was the pre-market inspection, a ritual that mirrored the way a farmer might inspect a horse before an auction. And imagine the bride during this process. Her skin is still raw from the alum bath we discussed earlier. The astringent salts have tightened her pores, but they have also left her flesh sensitive and stinging. She is encased in the breathless gown, the gold embroidery wire scratching against her neck, the copper dyes in the fabric beginning to irritate her chest. And yet, she must stand perfectly still while her future mother-in-law or a family lawyer inspects her like a piece of livestock. They are looking for the discounts. If they find a blemish, they will demand more gold. If her breath smells of the rot we know was caused by mercury, they will question her health and raise the price. This economic pressure explains the terrifying addiction to the poison. A bride didn't use lead and arsenic because she was vain. She used them because she was a bad investment otherwise. If a jar of Venetian Ceruse cost 10 silver coins, but it could hide the scars that were costing her father 200 gold coins, the choice was simple. The poison was a cost-saving measure. The health of the girl was a secondary concern, if it was a concern at all. Her only job was to survive long enough to sign the contract and produce an heir. The dowry trap created a toxic hierarchy among women. Sisters were pitted against each other. The beautiful sister was the golden child, the one who would save the family fortune. The plain sister was a burden, a drain on resources, a girl who was literally costing her father his life's work. Imagine the psychological weight of knowing your face has a literal price tag. Imagine the guilt of watching your father sell a piece of ancestral land just because your skin wouldn't turn white enough. Under this pressure, the pain of the plucking tweezers or the burning of the hair bleach wasn't just endurable, it was welcomed. It was the only way to earn your place in the family. And the market was brutal. If a family lied about a bride's beauty in the negotiations, if they used the chemical masquerade to hide a serious illness or significant scarring, the groom could sue for fraud. There are legal records from the 15th century of marriages being annulled because the bride was not as fair as promised. When the lead paint came off after the wedding and the truth of her gray, corroded skin was revealed, the groom would claim he had been swindled. The bride would be sent back to her family in shame, her dowry contested, her reputation destroyed. She was returned merchandise. This fear of being returned kept the poison on the face long after the wedding bells had stopped ringing. A wife had to maintain the illusion of the alabaster queen every single day to ensure her husband didn't feel he had made a bad bargain. The lead, the mercury, the arsenic, they became the permanent tenants of her dressing table. She was a woman paying a subscription fee in health just to keep her status as a wife. But there is a deeper tragedy in the price tag. Because beauty was so tied to money, it became a way to mask the decay of the era. The wealthiest families, the ones with the most gold, were the ones who could afford the most lethal poisons. This meant that the highest class of women were often the most physically compromised. The ideal bride was a woman who was slowly dying, but because she looked expensive, her death was ignored. The peasant bride, with her sun-browned skin and healthy blood, was cheap in the eyes of the market, yet she was the only one who was truly alive. As the quill finally stops scratching and the gold coins are counted out onto the heavy oak table, the contract is sealed. The bride is now a wife. Her family has paid the price and her husband has accepted the merchandise. But the transaction is not yet complete, for the medieval world demanded one final proof, a proof that couldn't be written on parchment or counted in gold, a proof that required the bride to surrender her most intimate privacy to a room full of strangers. For while the price tag settled the money, the next ritual would settle the blood. And in the flickering light of the bridal chamber, the masquerade was about to meet its most terrifying witness. In our next chapter, we enter the room where privacy died. We will discuss the legal verification ritual, the legal requirement for a marriage to be witnessed, and the chilling psychological toll of a wedding night with an audience. Close your eyes and imagine the most intimate moment of your life. Now imagine a dozen strangers standing at the foot of your bed, watching you. In our modern world, we treat the wedding night as a sacred sanctuary of privacy. But for the medieval bride, privacy was a luxury that died the moment she said, "I do." On the night when she was most vulnerable, she was forced to become a performer in a legal drama that required an audience. This was the legal verification ritual, and for centuries, it was the final, chilling requirement for a marriage to be considered valid in the eyes of the law and the church. The feast is winding down. The wine has flowed for hours, and the guests are rowdy, their jokes becoming coarser with every goblet. This is the moment the bride has dreaded since the dawn of her wedding day. She is exhausted. Her skin is stinging from the chemical bath, her head is throbbing from the heavy headdress, and her internal organs are still recovering from the crush of her stays. But the ritual is relentless. She is not allowed to simply retire to her chamber. She must be escorted. A chaotic procession forms. Musicians lead the way with bawdy songs, followed by family members, priests, and local dignitaries. They lead the bride and groom through the cold, torch-lit corridors of the manor to the bridal chamber. But they don't stop at the door. They surge inside. In medieval Europe, a marriage was not a private contract between two individuals. It was a public alliance between families and a transfer of property. And like any other legal transfer, it required witnesses. Without proof of consummation, the dowry could be contested, the alliance could be broken, and the entire financial structure we discussed in the last chapter could collapse. The death of privacy began with the undressing. The bride was stripped of her breathless gown by her mother, aunts, and sisters-in-law. Every layer removed was another layer of her protection gone. Meanwhile, the groom was undressed by his friends and male relatives. They were placed in the bed together, often under the heavy, velvet-canopied gaze of the onlookers. In some cultures, like in medieval Iceland, the law was chillingly specific. In medieval Europe, a marriage was a transfer of estate. Like any legal deed, it required formal observers, 6 officials standing in the room, ensuring that the legal contract was physically finalized. Imagine being a youthful figure of the era, because, as we know, that was the prime marriageable age for noble daughters. You have been taught your entire life that modesty is your greatest virtue, that your body must be covered, that your gaze must be downcast. And now, on the most terrifying night of your life, you are expected to perform the most private act imaginable, while your father-in-law, your priest, and your husband's rowdy friends stand a few feet away, making jokes and singing stocking-flinging songs. This was the stocking game, a bizarre and intrusive tradition where the guests would throw the bride's and groom's stockings over their shoulders toward the bed. If a stocking landed on the target, it was seen as a sign of fertility. It was meant to be light-hearted, a bit of wedding fun, but for the bride, it was a terrifying violation. She was being treated like a piece of livestock in a breeding pen, her dignity sacrificed for the amusement and legal assurance of the crowd. Before the guests would finally withdraw, there was one last ritual: the posset. This was a heavy, spiced drink made of curdled milk and wine, believed to have aphrodisiac qualities. The couple was forced to drink from the same cup while the priest blessed the bed, sprinkling it with holy water to ward off demons. It was a bizarre intersection of the sacred and the profane. God's blessing sought for an act being performed under the voyeuristic gaze of a drunken audience. Only when the curtains were finally drawn around the bed did the crowd begin to leave, but even then, they often stayed just outside the door, listening for proof. The silence of the bride was not an option. The next morning, the sheets would be inspected by the elder women of the family. If the proof of blood was not found, the bride's reputation was destroyed. Her father would be shamed, and her husband could claim she had deceived him. The pressure to produce this proof led some brides to keep small vials of animal blood hidden under their pillows, a desperate chemical masquerade of a different kind to save their lives from the judgment of the sheets. The psychological trauma of the legal verification ritual is a shadow that history has largely ignored. We see the romanticized tapestries, but we don't hear the crying. We don't see the terror of a girl who had no concept of consent, whose first sexual experience was a public performance for the sake of a land deed. Many of these brides had met their husbands only days before. They were being intimate with a stranger, while their own family members watched from the shadows. The impact of this violation often resulted in a lifelong aversion to intimacy, a frigidity that was then blamed on the woman's delicate nature. One of the most famous examples of the legal weight of the bedding ritual involves Catherine of Aragon and Prince Arthur of England. When Arthur died just months after their wedding, the question of whether their marriage had been consummated became a matter of international crisis. Decades later, when King Henry VIII wanted to divorce Catherine to marry Anne Boleyn, he used the lack of public witnesses to her first bedding as a weapon. Witnesses who had stood in that chamber 30 years prior were called to testify about what they had seen and heard behind those bed curtains. The most intimate details of a woman's life were dragged into the public courts, her worth debated by men based on a night she had endured as a teenager. This ceremony tells us everything we need to know about the status of the medieval bride. She was not a person. She was a vessel. Her face was a currency. Her body was a contract, and her privacy was a sacrifice. The lead on her skin and the mercury on her lips were meant to make her beautiful for this one night. But the night itself was a ritual of dehumanization. She was perfect on the outside, but inside, she was a woman whose soul was being crushed by the weight of 1,000 eyes. Why did they endure it? Because there was no other path. To refuse the bedding was to refuse the marriage. To refuse the marriage was to doom your family to poverty and yourself to the life of an outcast. The death of privacy was the final tax paid to a society that demanded everything from women and gave them nothing in return. As the sun rises the next morning and the household wakes up, the bride must once again apply her lethal mask. She must hide the exhaustion, the fear, and the trauma of the night behind a fresh layer of white lead and red mercury. She must appear at the morning mass looking serene and untouched. But the church she enters is not just a place of prayer. It is a place of judgment. For the very priests who blessed her bed are the ones who will now watch her every move, searching for any sign of sinful vanity. In our next chapter, we will look at the final, crushing weight on the medieval bride, the church's gaze. We will see how religion used the fear of hell to control the very beauty it demanded, and why a woman was damned if she did and damned if she didn't. If you paint your face, God will not recognize you on the day of judgment. These words, thundered from the pulpits of every stone cathedral in Europe, were the final crushing weight on the medieval bride's soul. Imagine our bride, her skin still tingling from the lead paint we know was killing her, sitting in the front pew of her parish church. She is surrounded by the scent of incense and the haunting chanting of monks. She looks like a saint, her face as white as the altar cloth. But as the priest stares directly at her, his voice dripping with holy fire, she feels like a demon. She is caught in the ultimate damnation trap, a world that demands she be beautiful to be worthy of a husband, and a church that tells her that very beauty will lead her straight to hell. In the medieval mind, your face was not yours, it was a divine creation. God was the ultimate artist, and to apply makeup was to suggest that God's work was imperfect. It was seen as an act of supreme arrogance, a repainting of the soul's window. The church fathers called it the devil's paint. They didn't see cosmetics as a tool for confidence. They saw them as a tool of deception. To them, a woman who painted her face was a liar, a fraud who was tricking men into a marriage based on a chemical illusion. They believed that when a woman painted her lips red with the mercury cinnabar, she was literally painting the mark of the beast upon her mouth. The rhetoric was violent. Saint Cyprian, a powerful voice in early Christian thought, famously wrote that God did not make you with red lips and black eyes. He warned that when the angels come to gather the faithful, they will pass over the women with painted faces, unable to find the image of God beneath the layers of lead and fat. To a medieval woman, this wasn't just a metaphor. It was a literal threat of eternal fire. Imagine the psychological torture. Every morning, she must apply the poison to secure her family's wealth and her own survival. And every Sunday, she is told that this very act has erased her name from the book of life. But here is the chilling hypocrisy of the era. While the priests railed against vanity, the social structure they helped maintain made beauty a mandatory requirement for female survival. The church praised the natural woman, but a natural woman with smallpox scars or a dark complexion was often denied the very marriages the church insisted she must have. The church demanded she be a virtuous wife, but to become a wife, she had to navigate a marriage market that only valued the painted mask. She was a prisoner of two competing masters, a society that required the poison and a religion that condemned the result. This conflict turned the bride's dressing table into a battlefield. Women began to hide their cosmetics in secret compartments, masking the scent of their lead powder with dried lavender so the parish priest wouldn't smell the metallic sin during confession. They developed a wholly aesthetic makeup that was designed to look like it wasn't there. This was the birth of the no-makeup look, but with lethal stakes. They would apply the lead so thinly and blend the mercury rouge so perfectly that they appeared naturally pale and naturally flushed. They were refining the art of the lie to survive the gaze of the church. The church's obsession with vanity went beyond just makeup. They targeted every ritual we have discussed. They condemned the forehead of God, plucking as a mutilation of the temple of the body. They saw the golden Venetian bleach as a prideful attempt to mimic the radiance of the saints. They even targeted the breathless gown, calling the restrictive stays and heavy gold embroidery engines of lust. They created a culture of perpetual guilt. A woman was taught to look at her own reflection with suspicion, to see her own beauty as a snare for men's souls, and a weight on her own. One of the most disturbing tropes of the time was the vanitas image paintings that showed a beautiful woman looking into a mirror only to see a rotting corpse or a demon staring back at her. These images weren't just art. They were psychological weapons. They were meant to remind the bride that her porcelain skin was just a thin veil over decay, that the lead she wore was a harbinger of the grave. The message was clear. Your beauty is a lie, and the poison you use to maintain it is the true state of your soul. Yet, despite the thundering sermons and the threats of damnation, the cosmetic industry flourished. Why? Because the fear of poverty and social rejection was more immediate than the fear of hell. A woman could repent for her vanity on her deathbed, but she couldn't repent for being an unmarriageable burden on her family. She chose the earthly risk for the earthly reward. She wore her lethal mask to the altar, took her vows before the very priest who condemned her, and lived her life in the shadow of a spiritual paradox. As we move toward the conclusion of our journey, we must recognize that this gaze of judgment didn't just come from the pulpit, it came from every corner of society. But in the cracks of this oppressive system, there were those who found another way. There were women who saw the poison and the judgment and chose a different path. They were the ones who refused to play the game, the ones who stepped out of the beauty trap and into a silence that was its own form of power. In our next chapter, we will discuss the silent resistance. We will look at the women who refused the poison, the nuns, the widows, and the outcasts who found freedom by embracing the very plainness that society feared, and why their choice was the most radical act of all. In a world where beauty was survival, choosing to be plain was a radical act of rebellion. While the court ladies of London and Venice were painting their faces with lead and swallowing arsenic wafers, there was a hidden army of women who looked at the poison jars and walked away. They were the ones who refused to be transactions. They were the ones who traded the golden mask of the bride for the gray wool of the nun, the black veil of the widow, or the lonely freedom of the outcast. These are the stories of the silent resistance, the women who saved their lives by losing their beauty. The most common escape route was through the heavy iron gates of the convent. In the medieval mind, becoming a bride of Christ was the only socially acceptable alternative to becoming a bride of man. When a young girl entered a nunnery, she was subjected to a different kind of ritual. Her long hair, the hair we know other women were bleaching with urine and lye, was shorn off. Her fine silk gowns were replaced by coarse habits, and most importantly, the lead and mercury were strictly forbidden. Inside the convent walls, the alabaster mask had no power. A nun's value was not determined by her skin or the height of her forehead, but by her prayers and her labor. For many women, especially those with the scars of childhood disease or those who simply found the beauty trap exhausting, the convent was a sanctuary of health. Here, they could wash their faces with plain water without fear. They could breathe deeply without the restriction of stays. They could live into their 50s, 60s, and 70s, ages that were nearly unreachable for the poisoned beauties of the court. The plain nuns were the longest living women of the Middle Ages, their longevity a silent testament to the benefits of rejecting the toxic aesthetic. Then there were the widows. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval life, a woman who had lost her husband occupied a strange, uniquely powerful position. For the first time in her life, she was legally an individual. She often controlled her own property and her own household, and as a widow, she was expected to be in a state of perpetual mourning. This meant wearing heavy black veils and, significantly, eschewing the use of cosmetics. A widow who painted her face was seen as a scandal, a woman looking for a new husband too soon. But for many women, the mourning period was a relief. They used the black veil to hide the gray, corroded skin that years of lead use had left behind. They embraced the plainness of grief as a way to let their bodies finally heal. The widow's weeds were a shield, a social permission to stop the self-poisoning. In the quiet of their mourning, many found a physical vitality they hadn't known since childhood. They became the matriarchs, the wise women who managed estates and guided the next generation. Their power rooted in their survival, rather than their appearance. But the most dangerous form of resistance came from the outcasts, the herbalists, the midwives, and the so-called witches. These were women who lived on the fringes of the village, who understood the very plants that others were using as poisons. They knew that belladonna could dilate the eyes, but they also knew it was a medicine for pain. They knew that mercury was a toxin, not a paint. By choosing to live close to nature and outside the marriage market, they rejected the chemical masquerade entirely. These women were often sun-browned and weather-beaten terms used by the elite as insults, but which actually signaled a life of physical freedom and outdoor labor. They kept their natural hairlines, their natural complexions, and their natural strength. Their resistance was a biological one. They chose a body that could work, heal, and endure over a body that was a fragile, painted ornament. Of course, this resistance came at a terrifying price. To be a woman who knew too much about chemistry and lived without a husband was to invite the suspicion of the church. The line between a beauty specialist and a witch was often determined by who you served, the noble bride or the peasant mother. We must also recognize the resistance found in the plain sister. In every family, there was often one girl who was deemed unmarketable due to her appearance. While her beautiful sisters were being groomed and poisoned, she was often overlooked. She was the one who was allowed to learn to read, to help her father with accounts, or to manage the household. While she may have felt the sting of rejection, she was also the one who avoided the lead tremors and the mercury rot. She was the safe investment of the family, the one who would be there to nurse her beautiful sisters as they succumbed to the toxins of their own success. The silent resistance reminds us that the price of beauty was always a choice, even if it didn't feel like one. By looking at those who refused, we see the beauty trap for what it truly was: a system of control. The women who walked away were not just saving their skin. They were reclaiming their humanity. They were asserting that their worth was not something that could be measured in gold florins or hidden under a mask of lead. As we reach the end of our historical journey, we are left with a haunting question. These women lived 500 years ago in a world of stone and shadow, under the rule of kings and priests. We like to think we are different. We like to think we have escaped the trap. But as we look at the legacy of the poison and the ways we still alter our bodies to meet a standard we didn't create, we must ask, have we really found the freedom the silent resistance was looking for? Or have we just traded the lead for something else? In our next chapter, we bring the story into the light of the present day. We will discuss legacy of the poison. We will see how the medieval standards of the US/UK markets still haunt our modern beauty industry, and why the fatal price is still being paid in the age of the internet. We like to think we are smarter than the medieval bride. Standing in our brightly lit 21st century bathrooms, surrounded by products labeled organic, dermatologist-tested, and paraben-free, we look back at the women who swallowed arsenic and painted their faces with lead with a sense of pity. We call them victims of a dark age. We marvel at their ignorance. But if Maria Gunning or Emily Marsh were to stand beside you today, looking into your mirror, they wouldn't see a stranger. They would see a sister. Because while the chemicals have changed, the ghost in the mirror remains exactly the same. The price of beauty was not a historical phase. It was the prototype for the world we live in now. The medieval lead mask didn't disappear, it evolved. In the US and UK markets today, we have replaced the thick paste of Venetian Ceruse with the needle. Consider Botox. We call it a miracle of modern science, a way to freeze time and erase the sin of aging. But what is it really? It is botulinum toxin, one of the most lethal biological substances known to man. We take the very essence of a deadly bacteria and inject it into the muscles of our faces to paralyze them, exactly as belladonna paralyzed the eyes of the Renaissance bride. We trade the ability to express emotion, the ability to be human, for a frozen, porcelain stillness. We have simply modernized the lethal mask. And what about the porcelain pill? The Victorian woman swallowing arsenic wafers to brighten her skin would recognize our modern obsession with weight loss miracles instantly. We see a resurgence of drugs and supplements that promise to transform the body from within, often at the cost of internal health. We see the same rhetoric. Purify your system. Shed the common weight. Become a new version of yourself. The side effects, the heart palpitations, the kidney strain, the loss of natural vitality, are treated as small prices to pay for the desired silhouette. The arsenic has been replaced by synthetics, but the willingness to risk the machine to save the image is unchanged. The church's gaze has also found a new, more powerful home. In the 15th century, the judgment came from the pulpit, a priest telling you that your vanity was a sin. Today, the judgment is decentralized, constant, and digital. It is the algorithm's gaze. We live under the perpetual scrutiny of the front-facing camera, the legal verification ritual. That terrifying loss of privacy we discussed is now something we participate in daily. We broadcast our most intimate moments, our morning routines, our very faces, to a global audience of strangers for likes and engagement. And just like the medieval witnesses at the foot of the bed, the digital crowd is a fickle, brutal judge. If your skin isn't glass-like, if your forehead isn't smooth, if your body doesn't fit the ideal form of the current month, the digital mob will let you know. The pressure that drove a medieval father to bankrupt his family for a dowry now drives a teenager to despair because they don't look like a filtered image on a screen. We have traded the fear of hell for the fear of being unfollowable. We have traded the priest's judgment for the comment section's vitriol. The forehead of God and the Venetian bleach find their modern echoes in the multi-billion-dollar industries of plastic surgery and hair transformation. We still pluck and burn. We undergo procedures to reshape our noses, our jawlines, and our hairlines, often forgetting that every surgery carries the risk of the fatal complication. We use chemicals to alter our hair color that still cause allergic reactions and long-term damage. We are still chasing a golden ideal that nature never intended us to have. We are still trying to outrun our own biology. Perhaps the most chilling legacy of the poison is the normalization of pain. We have a phrase in modern English, beauty is pain. We say it jokingly while we wax our skin, or while we recover from a surgical procedure, or while we endure the hunger of an extreme diet. We have internalized the medieval idea that suffering is a mandatory part of being a woman. We have accepted that our bodies are projects to be managed, battlefields to be conquered, rather than homes to be lived in. And just like in the Middle Ages, the peasant bride and the noble bride still exist. The wealth gap in beauty is wider than ever. The most effective and often most dangerous treatments are reserved for those who can afford them. The elite still set the standards that the rest of us kill ourselves trying to follow. We are still trapped in a dowry trap where our professional success and social standing are tied to how well we can mimic the perfect mask. But there is one final, hopeful connection. Remember the silent resistance? The women who walked away from the poison jars? They are still here too. They are the voices calling for body neutrality, the movement toward accepting the skin we were born in, and the growing rejection of toxic beauty standards. They are the ones pointing out that the glass skin is a filter and the perfect body is a surgical construct. They are the ones trying to break the cycle of 500 years of self-poisoning. As we look back at the entire history we have covered, the lead, the mercury, the belladonna, the arsenic, the suffocating dresses, and the public bedding, we must realize that we are at a crossroads. We can continue to be the poisoned bride, trading our health and our souls for a fleeting moment of social approval. Or we can choose the path of the resistance. We can recognize that our worth is not a chemical reaction or a monetary transaction. The medieval bride didn't have the knowledge we have. She didn't have the science. She didn't have the choice. But you do. You are the heir to her story. You are the one who can decide that the fatal price is too high to pay. The mirror is still there, and the ghost of the past is still watching. The question is, what will you tell her? Will you tell her that the torture was worth it? Or will you tell her that finally the mask has been broken? In our final chapter, The Final Veil, we will offer a tribute to the women of the past and a call to reflection for the women of the future. We will close the book on the deadly elegance and look toward a beauty that doesn't require a poison. The candles have burned down to their wicks. The heavy silk gowns have been folded away into cedar chests, and the lead-white masks have long since crumbled into dust. But as we lift the final veil on this dark tapestry of history, the faces of the medieval brides remain etched in our minds. They are not just names in a dusty ledger or figures in a faded painting. They are our grandmothers, our sisters, our ancestors. They are the women who walked into the fire of beauty standards so that we might one day see the light of self-acceptance. What is the ultimate price of beauty? We have seen it calculated in gold coins, measured in inches of plucked skin, and paid in the currency of shortened lives. We have seen the physical rot of lead, the mental collapse of mercury, and the silent suffocation of the corset. But the truest price, the one that history rarely mentions, is the loss of the self. Every time a bride applied that lethal ceruse, she wasn't just hiding a blemish. She was burying the woman God made to satisfy the woman society demanded. She was trading her reality for a costume, her breath for a silhouette, and her vision for a dark, dilated dream. We owe it to them to remember. We owe it to Maria Gunning, whose beauty became her executioner. We owe it to Elizabeth I, who reigned over a golden age while her own skin grayed and died beneath a mask of lead. We owe it to the thousands of unnamed young girls who sat on Venetian rooftops, their scalps burning, dreaming of a celestial gold that would never bring them peace. Their suffering was not a sign of vanity. It was a symptom of a world that refused to see them as anything more than beautiful ornaments. Take a moment to look at your own hands. Look at the lines on your face, the natural flush of your skin, the clarity of your eyes. These are things the medieval bride would have traded a fortune for. She would have given all her pearls for your ability to breathe deeply, all her gold for your freedom to walk in the sun without fear, and all her status for the right to be plain and still be loved. Your natural state is the luxury they were denied. But as we stand at the end of this 3-hour journey, we must recognize that the dark ages aren't just behind us, they are within us. Every time we judge ourselves for an imperfection, every time we punish our bodies to meet a fleeting trend, we are reviving the spirit of the toxic elements jars. The trap hasn't disappeared. It has simply become invisible. The fatal price is still being demanded by the algorithms of the 21st century, just as it was demanded by the dowry contracts of the 15th. So, let this be the moment the mask finally breaks. Let us decide that we will no longer be the merchandise in a transaction we didn't sign up for. Let us honor the victims of historical beauty by refusing to be victims ourselves. Real beauty isn't something that can be painted on with lead or swallowed in an arsenic wafer. It isn't found in the absence of pores or the height of a forehead. Real beauty is the courage to be seen, exactly as you are, without the masquerade. It is the ability to breathe, to see, to think, and to live fully, healthily, and without poison. The story of the medieval bride is a tragedy, but it doesn't have to be your story. The veil has been lifted. The chemicals have been exposed. The truth is finally in the light. Now, as you turn away from this history, take a deep breath, a deep, full breath that no corset can stop. Feel the blood rushing to your cheeks, a natural flush that no mercury can mimic. And look out at the world with pupils that are small, clear, and focused, seeing the reality that no belladonna can cloud. You are alive, you are here, and you are enough. If this journey through the dark side of beauty has changed the way you look in the mirror, please take a moment to subscribe and join our community of history seekers. Your support allows us to keep bringing these forgotten stories into the light. And before you go, I want to hear from you in the comments. Which of these historical beauty rituals shocked you the most? Is it the lead masks, the arsenic wafers, or the public legal verification ritual? Or do you see a modern beauty trend that scares you just as much? Let's start a conversation in the shadows below. Thank you for walking this long, difficult path with us. Until our next deep dive into the secrets of the past. Stay safe, stay curious, and above all, stay beautiful in the only way that truly matters, by being yourself. Good night.